Thank you everyone for continuing. And for the ones who are just connecting, welcome. My name is Claudia Marquez and I'm Senior Manager of the Solution Design Team in DHL Supply Chain. To continue, we'll have the conference Security in Transportation. What to expect after the pandemic? This conference will be transmitted through three channels Spanish, Portuguese, and English. Please select the audio by clicking on the button on the language you'd like to hear, which is above the transmission. During the session, you'll have the opportunity to ask any question you'd like through the chat, which is below the transmission. Please use this space only for asking questions and place the word question to identify them. For this conference, we have a well-known analyst with a lot of work in safety themes, Alejandro Ope. Alejandro was former executive of the Daily Post. He's specialized in Mexico. Plus, he's in charge of the projects in crime in Mexico. Between 2008 and 2011, he had several key positions in the Research and National Security Center, the CISEN. He was in from 2001 and 2005 in Geagro in the Economist Group, a consultant a company. From 1998 from 2000, he was the coordinator of the assessor of the Senator Adolfo Aguilar Sincer, and he collaborated in the transition team of former President Vicente Fox. As part of his transition, he had several assessment positions in the National Bank of Construction and Public Services of the Energy Department. He's collaborator and regulator in diverse national media such as El Universal, Animal Político, y la revista Nexus. Plus, he's co-author in the book The So-Called Strategy, 2 essays and 39 questions about security, justice, violence, and crime. He's got a bachelor's degree in political sciences from the University of Pennsylvania in the US. Alejandro, welcome. I'm so glad to have you here.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Thank you to all the organizers, DHL, and everyone who made this forum possible. And thank you to all the people that are connecting remotely to listen to us and giving us part of their time to discuss a very important issue in this sector. I don't think there is any participant in this sector that at any point of time didn't have any problem of thieves, extortion, maybe kidnapping. This is a problem that affects the whole industry. So I would like to do a recap starting from 30,000 feet above the ground, like in Mexico. What do we see, and what do I think applies to other countries that I think replicate the same problematics? I would like to give three messages. One, the robbery of transportation. It's a broad phenomena and generalized phenomena, and it is much more wide than what authorities recognize. Second of all, second message I'd like to say, even though this is a broad phenomena, it is also localized in some point at some time. There are certain local locations that give opportunities to for these thieves or these crimes to happen. And this information we know is out there. And the third thing is that this phenomena, as it is localized, as we know where it happens, we need to know when does it happen and how does it happen, and we must be able to manage the risks to these crimes, and it should be possible for the authorities to do something about this issue. If we don't do it or the authority doesn't do that, we need to ask ourselves what's going on. And that I will close my presentation with that open Q&A and see what is happening. Why do we have these phenomena? And let's say I start at 30,000 feet high. Wherever you see Mexico in any angle, I'm sorry, I think that. Okay, here we are. So, from every angle, Mexico is highly victimized. What do I mean with this? At every point, everybody has been a victim of some kind of crime. In the numbers I'll be using in this presentation come from surveys of victimization and not denouncements to the right authorities, because it is a very obvious reason most of the crimes are never denounced, and the crimes to people, 94% of attacks to people's rights are never denounced. So if we just go by the crimes that are being officially denounced, we would just see the top of the iceberg. So that's why we use surveys. We ask the population in some period of time, like 12 months, have you experienced some kind of demeanor? So in Mexico, we have a rate of 28,000 for every 100,000 inhabitants. What does that mean? That we have more or less 25 million victims in this country, and we have more or less 33 million crimes. From these, only 2 millions are denounced. So this translates that one of every three households in Mexico has at least one family member which was victim of at least one crime in the last 12 months. Okay, so this is almost generalized phenomena. I don't think there's anybody in this country or other countries similar to Mexico that can say he has never been the victim of any crime. And this goes for companies too. Companies are in this environment as well, where illegality and criminality are part of the landscape. And INEGI, which is our Institute of Statistics and Geography, we also have a survey for the victimization, and there's another one, victimization to companies. That is done every 2 years. It was about to happen in 2020, but the pandemic came. So there's a little bit some old data here, but anyway, this reflects reality. So one of every three economic units in Mexico, one of every three, has been victim of at least one crime in the last 12 months. So we have several millions. We have several millions unities. So let's say that 1.5 millions of economic units are victims of at least one crime in 12 months. So it is an enormous universe. It is huge. And only the tip top of the iceberg is visible or is denounced. So this phenomena affects companies of any size. The most of the unities, economic units, are micro businesses from 1 to 5 employees. And even though in that level, even 1/3 can be victims, and when the company is growing, as it grows complex, the probability for it to become a victim of a crime grows. In this survey, the big companies are defined as those with 250 employees or more, and 6 of every 10 are at least victim of one deficit in the last 12 months. So this affects all levels. And important, most of these are not denounced. The black numbers in crimes against companies is around 86.6%. So let's say that from every 100 crimes, 87 of them are not denounced to the authorities. So some that are denounced is never investigated, are never investigated, the ones that are denounced. So most of these, and to be honest, they are not denounced, first of all, because there's time that you waste in this, and second of all, there is a perception of futility. It is thought that nothing will happen because of this. So I insist, when we talk, when we discuss robbery to transportation and to merchandise, if we only see those crimes that are denounced, we will overlook most of the phenomena. So, how much does this cost to the country and to the economy? It's a huge cost. Incredible. More or less, the cost direct that we can vinculate directly to insecurity and crimes. INEGI made that calculation. Maybe it increased in 155 million pesos. So that is $7 billion more or less. So these are direct costs. The direct loss of robbery, of extortion, of vandalism, and on the other hand, half of that will be the defensive measures that companies must take to protect themselves to these delinquent activities. So this survey of victimization of companies, we know that 2017 companies expend almost 70 billion pesos in defensive measures. That is more or less $3.5 billion that are being expended in locks, in gates, in safes, in video vigilance, hiring insurance, having security companies, modifying the physical infrastructure. That is an estimate, and maybe that doesn't reflect the changes that companies actually do to their methods and their processes to protect themselves. So those may not be cataloged as safety measures, but maybe changing the shift, changing their procedures on how you get into the facility, maybe investigation costs, investigations on providers, on employees, all that adds up, right? And that adds up to additional costs to companies. So we're talking about billions of dollars that we need to put in the table every year to protect ourselves. So these numbers were considered for the INEGI as 0.08% of the gross domestic product, and for families they consider this 1.5 of the gross domestic product. So if we add this, we're talking about more or less 2.3 percentage of the gross domestic product, which are direct costs for insecurity. So from this universe, let's talk about robbery to transportation. Well, according to the survey of companies' victimization, it was the seventh crime that happened more often to companies, and the fifth, if we just eliminate like white collar crimes, like for instance fraud, crimes in which there is some way of violence, it is the fifth that's more common, and the robbery of merchandise that is being transported. And this is a number that it is growing. If you see, you will see an increase on this. The, the rate in 2017 was around 425 events of robbery of merchandise for every 10,000 economic units. So if we add this up, we can say that approximately one of every 23 economic units, or every one of every 23 companies, was a victim of robbery of merchandise in transit in the last 12 months. So this is an enormous universe, a lot of victims, a lot of companies of every level that suffer from these phenomena, and it reaches every sector of the national economy. And I am sure that in other countries, unfortunately, We don't have this instrument because this is only done like 2 or 3 par countries of the world, this service of victimization. And I think that if other countries did, we would see similar numbers. So, how frequent is this crime? Let's consider not the reported data because we know that is only they undermine the issue, but what we can learn from the victimization survey. So, more or less 10% of of the robbery to merchandise that it is in transit represents 10% of of the crimes against companies in any given year. So in 2017, the last data we have, around 300,000 robbery events in merchandise occurred. So from these, like 70% were not reported to the authorities. So from these 300,000, around 80 or 90,000 were reported, and the rest of that happened without the authorities noticing and without the authorities being obliged to open any investigation. And on top of this, even though this affects all the sectors and all the levels, it affects the big companies the most. And Enbe wonders what is the crime that affects the most every each of the kinds of these companies and levels. So in the big companies, it is the second crime that happens more often. In the medium, from 100 to 150 employees, it is the third most common. And it affects all the economy, but affects more and in particular, it affects in particular the most modern sectors of economy, those that are very mixed with international markets, with supply chains. Those are the sectors who suffer the most of robbery of merchandise in transit, robbery to transport units. Among all activities that companies do, product transportation on highways and mobilizing products in industrial corridors are perceived by the CEOs as one of the most riskful operations they have. In the data from 2018, 56% said felt insecure by sending products through highways. 55.7% felt insecure of sending products through industrial corridors. So this is an activity that it is perceived as companies as insecure, and they give a sensation of insecurity to all the economic actors. This is like the general universe of robbery to transport units and merchandise in transit. And I'll go to the following point. Even though this is generalized, even though this goes nationwide, it is also true that it is focused more in sometimes and in some uh, locations, and operators know this very well. Here I will mention reported cases. From reported cases to transportation units, almost half of them were from Estado de Mexico, where we're at now broadcasting this conference. It is here in this state, the state of Mexico, when the 50% of all the robbery to transport units are reported. It is not that they are made here, but here they are denounced. So, not only that, but if you see the map, the darker, the worse. So, it is not just localized in states, but in the very like counties. and most municipalities. So in Mexico State, just 6 municipalities comprehend half of the reports of robbery to transport units. Those are Ecatepec, Cuautitlán, Tultitlán, Tlanepantla, Chimalhuacán, Nezahualcóyotl, and the rest is 50%. So these 6 municipalities represent 25% of the reports to transport units in all the country. 6 municipalities. So let's say that this concentration goes even further. If we see this in some streets and in some neighborhoods, it is not just in 6 municipalities. Here I will show the data of Cuautitlán Izcalli, where we are at now. And you will see that 7 neighborhoods, 7 neighborhoods of this municipality of Cuautitlán Izcalli represent 40% of all the robbery to transport units. Why? Because the highways goes through this very place. So this zone where we're at in these streets, this it is the 60% of the robberies in the municipality to neighborhoods. So people know about this. There are very specific locations where these robberies happen time after time with and without violence. Operators, the ones that are listening to me, know this very well. It's nothing new. They identify this very well, and they know this doesn't only happen in certain places, but in certain days and certain hours. Sundays, they rest the thieves, but let's say that some hours of high transit and the afternoon and the evening and the night, some of these robberies, most of these robberies are taking place. And we know when also. So the question is, why aren't we doing something? That is a very obvious question, I think. Why? This data is known by the authorities. It is not a mystery. We know them. The industry knows them. So why does the problem persist? I don't have a single answer for this, but I would like to scatter some hypotheses that I think we can discuss about. First, it is important to say there's a very weak presence of the authorities in these areas. This might be applicable to other countries in the region. A friend from Colombia said a phrase that I think is perfectly applicable for all Latin America, that in Colombia there's more territory than state. The same happens in Mexico and in several countries of the region. What does this mean? That there are complete areas of the country where you will not see the presence of any kind of authority. I'll show a number that Okay, in Spain, the National Guard has 75,000 members. It is only in rural communities. So Spain is a fourth of Mexico's in territories. So if Mexico would like to have the same geographic coverage, the National Guard must be like 300,000 members, and our National Guard has just 90,000. And from these, 60,000 are borrowed. So to have the same kind of impact, we would need to have 3 times more. So the statal forces, whether it is federal or statal, they just are in urban areas. There are long extensions of territory. There are mostly in the north part of the country where you will not see any kind of patrol whatsoever. And that is known by many people in the industry. They are zones where you can just go with the blessing of God, and there is no kind of state presence. So this generates that many actors arise which carry guns, and there are other kinds of control in the territory. There are zones, there are other parties taking control of the territory. So this opens the door to all the exploiting forms of illicit economy, and one of those, of course, is robbery to transportation. Second of all, let's call things by their name. There is a lot of corruption in the justice system, and we we keep insisting on this. This information in the sector is known by the authorities. They know this is happening. They know when and where these robberies are happening, and aren't doing anything. Why? Because there's complicity, of course. And why? A part of this, of the robbery to transportation, is done by the authorities themselves. Risks for the transport units comes from the very authorities. So there is a lot of documentation how there are some regions in which the federal police extorted, or the state police extorted transportists themselves, like directly, and or they are in compliance with the band of thieves who do these illicit activities. In the way that this complicity keeps on, crime will keep on. So the third point that I want to throw in the table is that there is not enough coordination inside the government. Part of this robbery to transport units happens in federal highways, but happen in when they connect with the cities, and where the state government have some kind of role, and they also happen in specific municipalities where municipal polices could have some kind of role. Let's say that part of these robberies happen around the highways, in the communities around the highways, and if who needs to interfere there? Not the federal. Well, they don't respond because they don't communicate among them, like the municipal authorities, the state authorities, and the federal ones. The fourth point I would like to put on the table, and I think it is important, is that a lot of our highway infrastructure has not adapted, or it is not enough to prevent some of the attacks to transportation, freight transportation. So in many regions, you could do some minor adequations, like some kind of physical barriers with some kind of modifications. With these, you can prevent big number of these events. Let's say there are several zones in which there are breaches in the highways. That is very identified, that where there are several breaches, there is a space for crime. Why? Because cars go by these areas and they can hide when transport comes. And there's some minor adjustments, relative minor adjustments that you can do in the highway infrastructure. I will say also in the train lines, but these adjustments can have an important impact to prevent some of these crimes. The fifth point, this is a very Mexican thing, but I will add it because I think it is connected to some other kind of problems. In Mexico, I think we are having a very difficult transition from the federal police to the National Guard. During a long time, almost 20 years, the state, like how the state do to address transport robbery, was the state police, and the federal police of roads, Policía Federal de Caminos in Spanish. And there was corruption in there in the institutions, but at least it was clear who was responsible. Who was responsible of taking care of this, and people knew who to call in the companies when there was any kind of incident. But in the last year and a half, there has been a transition to a military nature, let's say, and part of this structure of vigilance and the highways and this regional security, a big part of that was lost, and there was no substitution for any kind of party. So sometimes there is not clear who is responsible, who needs to address this, if it is National Guard or the army, or if it is both, or if it is the federal police, because in some regions it persists these units of the federal police. So I think this has been the operation very hard, like safety operations for companies. And for what I've heard, is that they don't know who to call. If there is an incident, they just stole a whole trailer, they kidnapped an operator, who do I call? Before they called the federal police, sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but now it is not clear. And these transition issues will still happening for some time. The last point I would like to put on the table, just to open the conversation and not like to give any kind of judgment, but I think that many of the private parties have a lot of information about where these attacks are happening, when they are happening, where are the areas which have the most risk. And sometimes this information is not shared, or it's shared for mechanisms that are not very flexible. They go to safety groups, to informal groups too. And if you would like to see a map of what is happening to my competitors, so I can maybe do something, that is hard. And vice versa, it is hard also for me to share my incident data to my competition. So I think there is a lot of information out there that's being lost, and that could be very helpful to all the parties if there was an efficient mechanism to share this information. That being said, what do we do? I insist. We have a broad problem, but we have information on this. We know when it happens, where it happens, and how it happens. So why don't we address it? Why could that be? I think that we should think from our industry how to enhance communications with the National Guard, whether if it's good or bad. At least during this administration, that would be the institutional party that would be relevant to address this issue. So we need to at least build some kind of discussion with the National Guard or the army, the military, and the National Guard is kind of an arm of the military, but anyway, to see how can we fight this problem, because without communication with this party, I think the problem will be very hard to address. Second of all, I know that there are like some relationship with the government or institutions who have communications with the government. So this is one of the topics that lead to several. Okay, this is a perception, okay? And if there's somebody who's listening who would like to share his view, that's okay. But most of these, I think, is managed very like individually, because there is some sector pressure like the Kanakar and other parties in the sector. But most of the times the effort is lost in individual efforts and there is no collective effort well organized to pressure the authorities in any kind. Well, the federal government and protection for citizenships and the law enforcement agencies, but some of them they are local, and I think that is where the efforts are being lost as a sector because every party wants to do their own thing. Everyone has their own roots and logistics. So we should think of a common strategy to build a general strategy towards the authorities. A third party that I think we should work hand by hand with it is with the drivers themselves. I know many in the sector work hand by hand with the drivers, with public and private drivers, but I think there is an area of opportunity to point out where the vulnerable points at and what can we do physically to the infrastructure of our highways to make it harder for these crimes to happen. Third, no, sorry, fourth, okay. I think the sector invests a lot of technology, in GPS, in geocirca, in biovigilance and video vigilance, etc. My impression, and I think we should discuss more about this, but I think that there are areas of opportunity to improve how these technologies are being used. Many times you see they are control centers and businesses that move a lot of merchandise. They see that the trailer is going out of the reach of the GPS, for instance, and then what do we do? What are the associated products for this protocol to be broken? Well, you call 911 and you try to communicate with the driver and etc. But I think there are areas of opportunity to enhance the integration of the several technological solutions that we have now about this topic. And the fifth point, a complicated subject, but I think we should talk about this. How, in the transportation sector and logistics, how can we mutualize information from which each of the companies have and to put that in a platform that can generate accessible information for everybody? If we know that they are robbing certain place at certain times and certain ways, how do we share that so others in the sector can know that in the right moment? Because if they know that 3 days after, well, good luck. But this is a very dynamic phenomena. So we should think how to build a technological platform that would let us to integrate the information. I am sure that there's a lot of information out there, that there are tens and hundreds of thousands of crimes that are never reported, and the information is out there, but it is hard to get to. And lastly, every driver and every operator has their own modal risks and the protocols and the platforms to manage risk, but they are operating with incomplete information, I think, or insufficient information about the risks they will face while transferring products from place to place or between different regions of our country. I think that leads to consider like not so riskful some of the models of transportation and logistics. So we should maybe think how can we integrate with big data or other kind of tools? How can we integrate these risk models that allow the companies to manage their risks, the existing risks. I will finish my comments with this, and to build up a recap, let's insist on we're we have this issue that the transportation and logistics sector faces a wide range of crimes, and everyone in the sector should be aware of this, and it affects like the most modern sectors of economy. Second of all, it is a crime that happens in a predictable way, certain way, in zones that we know where they are located, in with patterns in time and space that are predictable. And this opens an opportunity, very important one, to manage these risks in a better way and to pressure the authorities as it should be to address this phenomena. With this, I will stop my conversation and please Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. I really enjoyed your conversation, and I think also our auditorium because we have so many questions and I cannot even count them. Let's take a look at some of them. Alejandro from Mexico, they're asking this. In which way do you consider that the new technologies can better help the security in the transportation and the things that they carry?
Well, in several ways, I think. One, there are more technologies that make it easier to trace merchandise throughout the supply chain, and they let us to control remotely the location of the units and the products. So I think there is no relevant actor in the sector that hasn't used the GPS technology in their units and visibility technology in their cargoes. So I think we should integrate. The problem is this: many of the companies operate based on their incidents. I have an incident, so I respond. It's very reactive, let's say. The response is reactive to the phenomena. When, if I integrated my information to what other people have as information, I could be more proactive in managing these risks. I think, for instance, using big data would make it easier to have access to the enormous amount of information there's out there about incidents. And if there was a way to share this information, I'm sure there would be a way to use these technologies in a better way, so we could be more proactive in how to use these tools, because I don't think there is any relevant actor in this transportation sector that's not using GPS or some kind of traceability, maybe for refill of cargo, or maybe some kind of tool that allows them to know what is happening to the product or the freight in each part of the chain.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Without any doubt, communication, the sharing, what is happening, is the best alliance that we can have in security subjects. From Mexico again, someone is asking, do you consider that the nowadays regulations are enough to guarantee this safety, or do they need to change?
I'm not sure if the problem is a regulatory problem. There is a regulatory discussion that the fools and the two cabins are more vulnerable or not. Well, I think that the problem comes, or the problem it is not, like the regulatory law that hangs upon the transport units, but that the authorities do not work with what those regulations allow them to do. I think the problem is not that the modalities in which the transportation is taking place. The problem is that authorities know where they are robbing and they are not doing anything, and sometimes they are not doing anything, the authorities, because they are in compliance or in complicity with thieves. I don't think this will not be fixed with more regulations on this. It has been said that we should be mandatory for everyone to use GPS, but I don't think that's a
Thank you,
solution.
Alejandro. From Brazil, they are asking, how does the situation is seen in the middle of the pandemic?
Well, I don't have the data from Brazil, but I will talk about the region. What the pandemic has caused. Let's say that. Also, with the contention measures for this pandemic, mobility has been reduced. Persons are moving less, products are moving less, and there's an economic recession that reduces some kinds of mobility, and that has reduced some some kinds of crimes. For instance, robbery to businesses in urban areas has gone down in a very important way. I wouldn't be surprised if in other countries of the region would have less robbery to transportation because there are less transportation units in the streets just because of that. But I think the effect is seen bigger than what it is in official data, and I think that because of that people is afraid of getting this disease, well, many people they never reported crimes, right? So with this fear of getting the disease, that is even less. I don't want to go into the authority office 2 or 3 hours, risk myself to get the disease. So that is why also the reports are coming down. In the end, this will be normalized as the economic activities are recovered and how the contention measures go down. But I think we didn't take advantage of this emergency to control more our territory. This is the case in Mexico, but it wouldn't be surprised that that's the case in Brazil too.
Thank you, Alejandro. Now we're going to take advantage of your knowledge in security, and they are asking us, do you know the robbery rate?
Well, in the consumption sector, no, it is hard there's no official data that makes like that pinpoints every sector. There's not. If you see the survey of victimization of companies, there's a list like the big sectors, but they're just a differentiation like primary sector and the service sector. So Like in subsectors, no, it is hard because there's no official data. But I wouldn't be surprised that, for instance, in consumption products was like more robbery rate because there is a well-established market for this kind of robbed products, and it is easy to sell the robbed merchandise. A big company called me some years ago saying that the toilet paper was being robbed a lot. It's easy to handle. Alcohol is robbed a lot, cigarettes, because there is an illicit market which are relatively big and which is where it is relatively easy to move merchandise, and I think the rate would be higher.
Thank you, Alejandro. From Mexico, they are asking, how can we help in the transportation work to be more safe?
Well, first of all, with protocols, adapting safety protocols. Many do that is adapting or reviewing these protocols, and number two, reporting whenever possible. I understand it is complex many times. I understand it it is riskful for drivers to report these. Mostly in areas where there's high organized crimes, it is not easy to report things. But crime shouldn't like get out of the problem like they are not reporting crimes. That shouldn't happen. Number three, we should manage and share information with others. With sector organisms, informal organisms, or with technological platforms that can be built especially for this. I think that if every actor in this industry shares the information he has with its peers and competitors, if you can mutualize this information, I think we could all take better decisions, make better decisions to manage risk in a better way. And for crime to happen, for any crime to happen, three conditions must be accomplished. First, that there is a motivated thief. Second, that there is a target, an easy target. And the third is that there is a lack of somebody who surveils or prevents this crime from happening. What the industry can do something is in the second element. How can we do it a little harder for them? And there are several ways to do it, but one of them is maybe for small and medium actors in the industry, they would have a lot of benefit if they had access to the information of the bigger actors.
Thank you, Alejandro. From Mexico. Sorry. A second question from Mexico. Are these measures, safety measures, are duplicable?
Well, they are good practices that we could replicate. There are some protocols that we could use, but of course, the phenomena has some particular aspects in every zones. You know, there are zones which this is very severe, as the state of Mexico and Tamaulipas, and the case of some northeast states where there are higher risks for those that you will see maybe in Yucatan. And it depends of what you are transporting. And getting back to the subject, if we transport consumption products, you would be an easier target or a more attractive target if you are transporting maybe steel or steel bars. It depends of how heavy the merchandise is, the volume of it, how easy it is to sell. And if, of course, there are good practices that can be established, like in a general fashion, but every subsector and every region is particular and we need to adapt to them.
Sure. Thank you a lot, Alejandro. a good help for our for carriers is Canacar. What do you think? These chambers, are they a support or are they not?
I think Kanakar plays an important role in several aspects. One, it allows you to manage in a collective way the demands of the sector, like in a more efficient way that any individual company could do on their own. So it is easy to give the message of the sector in a better way. Number two, today we can have a platform to share better practices, to share information, and what I'm saying in this conversation is how can we mutualize information to share it in a better way, in a secure way. I think there are Kanakar and other organisms of the sectors, and even some informal groups that exist. They can be a key part of this. These efforts, collective efforts, I think we should embrace them.
Thank you, Alejandro. One of our carriers is asking, Alejandro, besides reporting, what actions do you recommend us to take?
Well, it depends. I don't know what is the specific situation of the person who made this question, but I can say that this can unite with some other lines of transportation, maybe a cheaper way to get access to technology. The problem of the man slash truck, which is a very important in transportation in Mexico, is that investing in technology to prevent crime, it's very expensive for somebody who has one or two transportation units. So if they can join their efforts with others, the cost of these measures will be reduced, and so you could have a better management of the risks that you will face in the transportation sector. I wouldn't dare to recommend any specific thing without knowing specifically what does this person transport, but if he or she can get into more collective effort, they would be able to reduce the risks they are facing.
Thank you. We have
And
to have allies. Another question from Mexico. One of our clients, in fact, that is here today. We have safety rules. As DHL, do you consider that other companies should replicate this?
well, I think the best practices must be replicated. I think, first of all, we should document what are the best practices. And this is a role that the sector organization should do and the informal groups that exist within the industry. Of course, we praise DHL, but beyond what's doing, we should find ways to disseminate these good practices, these protocols that are working, the technologies that are more efficient with other agents or other actors in the sector, and we should find what are the ways to disseminate the information. Maybe the organizations is one of them, but there's also specialized magazines, there are congresses, there are several ways, but of course, the best practices must be replicated.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alejandro. Now we're going to into a second session in question. And now we have a question from someone watching us from Brazil. As you mentioned, Alejandro, in Brazil we have a lot of insecurity and we're updating the floats. Do you think we need to invest in technologies that exist already in Europe or United States, or do you consider that the region goes behind it?
Well, number one, yes, we are behind in several aspects. We are very there are a lot of diversity in our region. There are some countries that have some aspects that have a better technology in transportation security, but maybe the vast majority of the operators do still have the same relatively primitive operations. And the answer, well, in Mexico, I think there are companies that have avant garde procedures, and the technologies that some companies use in Mexico are just as those that they use in Europe or the United States, but that is not the vast majority of the sector. The question behind this is how can we do for these operators, the small and medium ones, to adopt and these medium and small actors are the vast majority of the ones affected of this robbery of merchandise and transport units. How can they adopt the technologies and the practices that can allow them to manage the risks in a better way? So I don't have a very good answer to this question, but I do think of there are two things about this. The first of them is that the problem is not resolved just with technology. It is not a matter of getting a GPS unit in the trailer. A GPS unit without a process, without the geocerca or protocols of incident attention, or without a built up relationship with the authorities, is not very useful. Actually, some of the crime organizations, some of these bands which are very sophisticated do have blockers for these kind of signals. So to invest in technologies will not help these medium and small operators to just resolve the problem. What we must think is how can they integrate to lines or organizations which are wider so they can adopt procedures which are maybe more complex. And in Mexico, the vast majority of the industry is a man truck. That man slash truck will not be able to adopt the practices of DHL. But the question is, how can we um, level them up? How can we generalize the use of technology in the sectors, in a wider sector? And I think we should talk with the authorities. It is crucial. And also to talk with the sector groups like Canacar to organize these operators, small and medium operators, and to allow maybe to buy equipment in a collective way or to build financial institutions to receive credits for this kind of operators, something like that. And it depends, but for the modern sector, for the Latin American economies, I am sure that many of the operators in Mexico, Peru, Brazil, Argentina, Colombia have practices and protocols which are much more sophisticated than their partners in the US and Europe because the risks that they face here
We have more
is
expertise.
worse. I am convinced, yes, that it should be the other way, that the Europeans and the United States should learn from the tactics that we use here in America Latina.
Sure. Thank you a lot, Alejandro. What good practices? I mean, you talked about that definitely in Latin America we should have more expertise in this, but which other good practices from other countries could be replicated in Mexico?
That's a complex question. Let me try. I think that there's a growing chance to take advantage of big data and to utilize tools that allow us to analyze data massively to analyze risk. I think what we could do, and maybe it is not so linked to the sector but to the government, I think we should put pressure on the authorities to make information transparent. I think, well, some states, some federal entities in Mexico are transparent in their informations, and you can see up to the street level where do incidents occur. To pressure the authorities to make this data transparent will allow us to have access to a big amount of data that will allow us to process risks in a better way. Let's say that in Mexico we do have some bad practices, and I guess that in some other countries of Latin America too, we think that technology is the solution, that if we invest in a piece of equipment and if we don't integrate that to a process within our organizations, that we will just solve the problem. So I see that many companies of the sectors invest in geocircas and GPS and software, but if they do not integrate these processes, the security area, if they don't integrate what they do with the operational area, and the security area is just seen like those who come and put stones in my way and add some costs to my operations, um, in the measure that this grows low, you end up having expenses that are futile or they don't are efficient as they would be in other circumstances. But rather than a specific practice, I will say, or I think that we should think, how should we integrate this better? The security areas with the operational areas, and the security area not to be, as it happens in some companies, just like a lump that it is beside the day-to-day operation of the company. Maybe there are some administrative practices that we should take.
And I think that at the end, like you have been mentioning, a part of this is the coordination and communication within the company among the different areas and after with other companies from the same sector and from the different industries. Alejandro, the recommendations that you give are enough to face a crime that has social basis?
Well, we have seen in Mexico in several moments and several situations, we have with a lot of frequency in the north part of the country where there was a lot of train robbery or a lot of robbery to trailers. I have the impression that without like undermining these incidents and the severity of these issues, I have the impression that the vast majority of the robbery to transportation is not that, but it is organized bands that organized bands that have a lot of social background and also institutional background that have complicity with local authorities. So, more than the social basis of them, I think it is more worrying or worrisome these institutions that are behind the band of thieves that protect them and they allow them to rob transport units. That is very well documented that it happens, and it happens in many regions of the country. This complicity happens in various levels. One of them is just not doing anything when the robbery is taking place, and in other moments, mm, doing as towers for the units. Sometimes the police makes the call and says the transport unit is coming. So this second part of it is grave. These scenes where they rob a whole train or they rob a whole trailer, they are of course very shocking. And also oil robbery that has affected a lot of country, but the vast majority of this is that they are bands that have the assistance of several institutions and authorities, and I would put my aim in that.
Sure. Thank you, Alejandro. Is there a specific technology that you recommend?
Well, no. To put it that way, no. Because I think that more than technologies, small transport companies should bet on processes. How can I get more information that information I have, and how can I adapt my operation to minimize the risks that I am facing? And I think that we should rather bet to procedures or maybe technologies that give this kind of information and like when these robberies are happening and all that, because they do exist. And besides that, maybe many of them have GPS units, have technologies or tools that allow them to trace their products. But we should no, that if we invest more in that, that will not protect them. That will be very costly to them. And what I would bet on mechanisms to generate more information. The advantage that the big companies have versus the small ones, my impression is that they have more information about where the incidents are happening, where, how, and when.
Okay. We have just a couple of questions from Mexico. After the pandemic, do you think robbery will go high or go low?
I think it will go up because same reasons that it went down. Because what the pandemic did was it reduced mobility because of the measurements that were taken by the authorities and by the society to protect themselves from the disease. So the fall of the GDP in Mexico came to be 18% in some months. So in the way that these measures are are removed and the activity keeps on growing, mobility will increase too. But if there is more merchandise on the roads, if there is more merchandise through industrial corridors where most of these assaults take place, we would see how the phenomena will be normalized. And there's a question very close to this one. The economic crisis that will come, will that generate more robberies to transport units and more crimes in general? I'm not so sure. Why? Because if you rob a trailer with gun in hand, it is not a famelic robbery. It is not that you're robbing because you need to eat. It happens because it is an organized crime that happen in networks of crime that are very well defined and that happen in complicity with authorities. So I don't think that the reduction of economic opportunities in the legal frame will lead to more robberies, but what we should do in the sector that in the way that the activity is normalized also crime will do.
Thank you, Alejandro. What alternative are there to react before these situations?
It's a good question. There's no good answers. These these devices that block the signal, I I would say that the information of where these bands are working, those who use the signal blockers, it is an information that is available in the sector, and many operators have them and they know where that happens. And in the way that we can share these, maybe we can manage in a better way and try to avoid certain highways at certain times with certain kind of products, because there is a technological response for this. Well, let's wonder, maybe there are some generations which are more advanced in GPS technologies which are harder to block, but beyond the technological solutions that I am sure securities areas of the big companies are very aware of these technologies, that even though that is true, the problem in the root of it is that you should know how should you avoid to get in the way of these block the inhibitors of signal blockers.
Thank you, Alejandro. You talked about processes that you recommend to use mainly to buy a type of technology. Do you have any suggestions? Which processes are the ones which can be make better?
Well, for instance, there is no there is no communication between the security areas and the operational areas unless an incident occurs. I think that if we create areas or internal areas or mechanisms within the companies in which the security department is like in close communications with operation department, that would make it easier to adopt the measures in a proactive way. And also, information of the incidents ends up in some Excel sheet in someone's computer, and that is not integrated to the database and to the processes of decision making of the institution. So there should be mechanisms that allow us to manage the information in a better way that is coming from the drivers and field, how they try to rob me, when they try to rob me. There are some spectacular databases, and some others are not. I think I would invest more in information technologies and models of data processing than in, or rather than in technologies like themselves.
Okay, Alejandro. It's always interesting for our sector to have a big outlook of the risks that we face every day. And what better to have it with you? Definitely, it's an honor of
Thank you
having you
so
here
much. It
today.
was a pleasure.
Well, I thank everybody, and I remember that you can share your experiences in your social media using hashtag DHLTF 2020. At 3 p.m., we'll here with you with technology panel in order to discuss this. This conference will be available in Spanish, English, and Portuguese, and you'll be able to see it in our website that you can see now on screen.